Of course, Bhante. Thank you.
Oh, you. There we are. So, hello to everyone at Kalalgoda for the retreat today. Wonderful that you're doing a retreat, the monthly retreat. What a wonderful resource it is to have that. And especially after a period of the lockdowns and all the restrictions. And this, of course, you recognise, and I think probably have heard that Venerable Nissarano, this is Venerable Nissarano, speaking to you from Newbury Buddhist Monastery in Victoria in Australia. And we're about 90 kilometres from Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria. So that's very good. And to let you all know that we had a wonderful visit from Ajahn Brahm. He was here recently from the 19th of February until the 2nd of March. So we had a lovely time with him. And I think maybe, who knows, he may be going to Sri Lanka someday soon because he can travel again. So just like to mention that the format will be this talk, which is, I think, 10 o'clock your time now. And then later in the afternoon, 1:30, the guided meditation to finish off the proceedings for the day. So I can begin. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So just keep an eye on the time. I think you're probably going to have your lunch straight after this, so I don't want to go over time. So I'd like to begin with some gathas from the Lord Buddha. And I'll do them in English, so there we are. Driven only by fear, do people go to many refuges, to mountains, forests, parks, trees, and shrines. None of these is a secure refuge. None is a supreme refuge. Not by going to such a refuge is one released from all suffering. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So you may recognize that it's a part of a series of verses, gathas, from the Dhammapada. You probably recognize that one. And of course, you know, this going for refuge to mountains, forests, parks, trees, shrines, places, aren't they? Places where earth devas or spirits can be sought to make offerings. A bit similar, really, in a sense, to Devaliyas, I suppose. And it reminds one of when the Bodhisattva was just before his awakening, enlightenment, when Sujata offered the Kiribati at the tree. She, or her maid to begin with, thought the Bodhisattva was a tree spirit. And so she wanted to make this offering so that her employer could have a child. I think that was the aim of making the offering. So today, as you gathered probably from the gathas, I'm going to speak about refuge in general, as well as refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. So that's the theme. In Sri Lanka, you probably don't hear many talks about refuge. It's probably something that's taken for granted. But when you live in the West, of course, refuges are very important. A good understanding of it is very important, but it's good for all of us, you know, for our practice. And especially because we live in very uncertain times, don't we? I mean, I saw the Rahanta wearing the mask, and I was going to have my mask on too, because we are still wearing masks here when there are, you know, large groups inside. But of course, the COVID situation here is improving, though you may see the figures and wonder about that. But it's given rise to a lot of, it's given rise really, hasn't it, to the sense, the reality actually, that our lives are all very uncertain. We cannot cannot assume that things will just continue as they always have. We cannot sort of have that feeling of things having a regularity, a predictability to it. And of course, COVID is only one of those things. And now we have the war in Ukraine, don't we? Which has really, compacted things, as now the world is really concerned about whether we're about to have a nuclear war. So in these uncertain times, we need to depend upon something that gives us strength, don't we? We really do. Something that gives us a direction in life. It's like a compass, really, isn't it? Refuge. Something that gives us purpose and something that makes sense of our experience. And also in the process is leading to understanding the nature of reality. And refuge is really pointing us in that direction when we take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And it's such an important foundation to our lives, refuge. When we think of a house, isn't it? If the foundations aren't good, how long is the house going to last? The house will be subject to collapsing, to the vicissitudes, the problems of earthquakes, weather, whatever. So the foundations of our lives are very, very important. And of course, those foundations also provide stability for the mind, because this is one of the very important qualities that taking refuge offers us, that sort of stability. And one of the things I've often reflected on is, and people often ask too, don't they? Why is it so common for foreign monks to disrobe? And I often reflect that it's due to a lack of faith that comes from their refuge not being deep enough, their connection not being deep enough. And in the West, for instance, where people can think of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in so many ways. I mean, I read a paper by Bhikkhu Bodhi where he said people can think of him as the Buddha as a benevolent sage, or as an astute Asiatic philosopher, or this one I really liked, I thought it was a very nice phrase, or a genius of meditative technology. A genius of meditative technology. Isn't that funny? That's really funny. But of course, refuge is such a central part of Buddhism, isn't it? And taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha is really the heart of Buddhism. It made me reflect, as it might make you reflect too. We don't hear this word of refuge so much in other religions, though when you reflect on it, it's obviously it's the essence of devotion, the essence of devotion, which may link up with the yogic and Hindu traditions, the idea of bhakti. You hear of bhakti in Sri Lanka too. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about why is taking refuge so important. Without sincerely taking refuge, our practice of the Dhamma won't be deep. The refuge is taking refuge, taking the precepts, really empowers our practice of the Dhamma. And how does it do that? And of course, we can I immediately think anyway, of the indriyas. These are the five, in English we say 5 controlling factors. There can be various. When we say controlling, it means that they're predominant factors in the mind. And the first one, of course, is faith. And where's that coming from? It's fed by refuge. And that sense of taking refuge gives rise to faith, which motivates us. It really energizes our practice. So you immediately get the flow on to the second indriya, which is virya, which is energy. And then the third, that energy flows into the mindfulness, sati, which stabilizes and strengthens the mind. And that stability is, of course, reaches its peak when samadhi arises, that one-pointedness in the mind. And then, of course, from that one-pointedness, from that depth, that clarity, that power of the mind, that is still, that is one-pointed, we can develop wisdom or understanding, panya or prajna, as we often say in Sri Lanka. So this refuge is such a central, such an important part of our practice. And it's, I mean, we can think of it in other terms, of course, you know, that it's energizing our practice of dana, sila, bhavana. We hear very much about that in Sri Lanka, don't we? I use it quite a bit too. But most importantly, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path, the Arya Stanga Magga, you know, that the path to liberation. So, and of course, you know, in a very basic way, isn't it, or very obvious way, taking the three refuges is our membership of the Buddhist community. It makes us a Buddhist, even if we don't take the 5 precepts. Many Buddhists, they take the refuges, but are not really practicing the precepts. So that's, but taking the refuges is enough to become a Buddhist, as well, identify with being a Buddhist. But it reminds me of the rather humorous saying from Groucho Marx, and he said, "I wouldn't want to join any club that would have me as a member." I wouldn't want to join any club that would have me as a member. Now that's very funny, isn't it? It's quite humorous. But I know in the West, people don't like to be labelled as Buddhists or whatever which in a sense is showing a lack of real understanding of the incredible uniqueness of a Buddha, the incredible power and wisdom of a Buddha. It's not recognizing that. And so people prefer not to label themselves Buddhists. Sayings like, well, the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, was he? Which is quite a humorous one too. So, and when we do take precepts, you know, like you did this morning, I would imagine, taking the 5 precepts or the 8 precepts, it's like a formal declaration, you know, making it public when we do it. Of course, in Sri Lanka, where it is often a formality, it doesn't quite have that power. As everybody else is doing it, you would feel more out of place not taking, wouldn't you? That's probably more the case. But when we do anything publicly, and it's like a commitment, isn't it, that we're making, and it can make a strong impact on our minds. And it reminds me of a story that Ajahn Bodhidharma, one of the monks that's staying here at Newbury, he's a Swiss monk, very, very good monk. He reminded me of a lovely Thai man in Western Australia, and he would request the 3 refugees and 5 precepts, the 3 refugees. I quite like that. But in actual fact, and this is one of the headings or one of the titles for this talk, we are all refugees. But that is the reality, actually, that we are all seeking a safe haven. And we don't have a secure refuge. You know, remember the Gata from the Dhammapada that I just read out? It mentions these are not secure refuges. And we are all, I mean, people may say, well, I'm not a refugee. I'm living in Sri Lanka. I'm living in Colombo. I'm not going anywhere. But of course, you probably see, as we see here, all the refugees in the Ukraine. And for them, you know, maybe a month ago, the whole idea that they would be refugees was just unthinkable. But this is the nature of samsara. We cannot rely on it. We cannot depend on it. And it reminds me that we're all refugees, hastening and hurrying through samsara, repeated rebirth, fettered by craving and blinded by ignorance. And a very real part of this is there's no stability, there's no permanent resting place in samsara. And to tie in with this theme of the refugees that I just mentioned, I wanted to quote a wonderful quotation from Ajahn Chah when he visited a Thai monk in France. And this Thai monk had many disciples that were refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and also from Vietnam. And many of them had been traumatized by the terrible things they had witnessed or had suffered in their own homelands. And he said, he listened to their stories, and there must have, I think many refugees have terrible stories. We hear about them here in Australia. Often, Vietnamese people that came to Australia by boats and so on. And he said, and I like this quote very much, it really puts all of our experience into focus. He said to these people, these refugees, give up thinking about it. Obviously about the traumas and the suffering they've been through. Things that have passed, like the days that have gone by. Don't keep grasping onto them like thorns to pierce yourselves. Look at it as if you have been reborn. Where is your home? Now it's right here. You have friends and family here. The place that you have left wasn't really your home. If it was, then you could still live there. In fact, we have no real home in this world. Wherever we live, we simply create a convention that it is our home. But it's not really. Before long, we have to move on. So while you're here, put effort into being here. Make your life here. Make your peace with being here. So that's a wonderful statement, actually. I think that's very wise for all of us, isn't it? Even though, most of us are not refugees at this moment, it's possible that one day we will be in terms of samsara. And we all have to move on. These homes that we make in this life, and of course, once we pass, the body passes away, we'll move on to new abodes, new homes. Often we try and come back to situations that we are attached to, of course. But even those, that's the interesting thing. You go back to places that you've been many years ago, it's different. It's not the same. And of course, that's the way of samsara, isn't it? That it's the impermanence, the instability, the continual moving on, the continual change. And so with these refuges and the precepts, we don't take the refuges and precepts just one time. And that in Sri Lanka, every ceremony or any pincomer, they'll be taking the refuges and the 5 precepts. But when we take it on a daily basis for ourselves, that really strengthens, reinforces the refuges and the meaning of the precepts. And it creates sort of a framework for us too, doesn't it? A familiar framework and something that gives us some assurance. And I know for myself, I like to take the refuges every day. I can't take the bhikkhu precepts. We have 227. It'd take up quite a bit of time. But taking the 5 precepts every day is a wonderful way to remind ourselves of the importance of these precepts, of the importance of these refuges. Because it connects us, doesn't it, with our aspirations. And we can keep them in mind. We don't take them automatically. I think, just as a ritual, where we take them in a really meaningful way. And one of the things I do, and I think it's always good for everyone actually, is when we take the refuges and precepts, do it in your own language too. So I do it in Pali one day and in English the next. And that way, the meaning sinks in much more. When we just use, say, the Pali, it's great, but the meaning doesn't sink in as much. And it reminds us, it keeps in mind what's really important in our lives and the values we want to live by. These are important because anyone who keeps the 5 precepts, who practices the 5 precepts, will realize the world is not running on these precepts. Often people think them as terribly basic, nothing special, but they're in actual fact very, very special. And this, as I mentioned, this repetition creates a habit in the mind, so that we tend to incline in that direction towards the Dhamma, towards the precepts, towards reflecting on the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. And so it gives us direction in life. And that's wherever we incline the mind, the Lord Buddha said, that's where the mind will tend to go. Whether we incline it in a positive way or if we incline it in a negative way. And of course, the power of refuge is really based on the emotion of saddha or shraddha, we use in similar. But it is also informed. It's not blind faith, it's a faith that's informed by an understanding, an intellectual understanding of the Buddha's teaching, to a certain extent, the importance of sila in our lives, the importance of wisdom, kindness, and many good qualities. And of course, that they give make sense of our experience. And when we investigate our experience as we go through life, day by day, learning from our mistakes, usually learning from difficulties, then we can reflect, compare that with the Dhamma, and that will deepen our refuge and our faith, because we will see in our own lives, yes, this is true for me. It was true for the Buddha, but it's also true for me. This is an important thing when we investigate the Dhamma. We are making it our own truth. So I'll just briefly mention what the dictionaries say about what a refuge is. And this is from the Collins Dictionary, and it says, a shelter or protection as from weather or danger. And this is the next one I like too, which is any place, person, action or thing that offers or appears to offer protection, help or relief. But I don't know about you, but often when we think of refuge, the first question that comes to my mind, maybe to your minds too, what are we seeking refuge from? What are the dangers we're seeking refuge from? And of course, it's exactly what the Buddha was talking about. We're seeking refuge from rebirth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Again, not only once, again and again and again and again, and so on. This is the nature of samsara. And these are suffering. These are the physical and mental problems in our lives. So this is what we're really, why we're taking refuge. We are looking for a refuge from these. We are looking for an answer to these, which the Dhamma can provide. And of course, that's one of the other things that refuge provides. It provides us a shelter from a way of finding meaning to life. What is the meaning of life? People often say. And so an understanding reality, because we don't understand reality as the Lord Buddha discovered for himself in the Four Noble Truths, because we don't understand the way things are, it creates a lot of suffering for us. And we have all these expectations which have nothing to do with the reality. And of course, that leads to suffering, in a big way. So, and of course, one of the refuges we're looking for is to find an answer to anicca, that nothing lasts. When we're looking, how do we deal? This is part of understanding reality. How do we deal with the fact that everything changes and things aren't reliable or dependable? And so this is an aspect of our refuge. And of course, a refuge is also, we're taking refuge from making bad karma through our actions, our speech and thoughts. Because when when we have the refuge in Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, it reminds us, yes, let's be careful about let's be kind actually with what we do, what we say, and what we think. And of course, we take refuge because if we create if whatever karma we create will take us to our next life, whether fortunate or unfortunate, sugati or dugati. So I think it's very worthwhile to reflect on what things we usually take refuge in, because we realize that for most people, Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha are not really their real refuge. They haven't made Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha their real refuge. Maybe they have not encountered it if they live in the West. So when I reflect on this, I realize that the Lord Buddha's teaching on upadana, attachments, and the things we cling to, is really where most of us are looking for our refuge. And of course, as I mentioned in that dictionary definition, we seek refuge in people, places, things, and activities that offer or appear to offer protection, help, or relief. And of course, that refuge in people, we see it big time, isn't it? We go for relationships, and they're so important to us. And for maybe in terms of people, teachers, both those teachers in the school or university, wherever, and spiritual teachers too, we're really attached to them. Some of these are worth attaching to, some are not. And of course, artists, singers, in Sri Lanka, cricketers, probably sports people in general, actually, we see that very much. Politicians, we see that a lot. And of course, one of the big things in many religions is God, the idea of God. And refuge in places, people love to travel, which is why COVID-19 has made it difficult for them, because we have to stay at home. And staying at home with ourselves is not always that easy. And traveling can distract us. And of course, there are many beautiful places that we can enjoy when people travel, natural places, even going to holy places. I'm sure many people in Sri Lanka will be lamenting the fact that they haven't been able to go on pilgrimage for the last couple of years. And of course, a refuge in things, we can all think of possessions, money, maybe power, status, and refuge in activities. There's so many of them, isn't it? Sport, cricket, gambling, working, eating, drinking, lots of activities. But the Buddha's analysis, of course, of what we are attached to, what we're taking refuge in, is usually much deeper than that, isn't it? And of course, it's the six senses. We're attached to sights, all those beautiful things, or things that we consider beautiful, others may not. This is quite an interesting thing, whether it be cars, houses, people's bodies, other people's bodies, furniture, whatever. And you see the internet totally based on appearances, based on sights and sounds. Sounds, of course, music, conversations. We're all familiar with these things, but it's so interesting when we look at our lives, how we whether you use the word refuge, we seek a lot of comfort in these five senses. It's a world we know, whether it be the world of sight, sounds, tastes. Food is always extraordinarily popular pastime, isn't it? And so important to us. And we realize how much the food we are brought up with, the familiar food, how much that we enjoy that. Not everybody would enjoy it. You can see different tastes in foods. So food, and of course smells, odors, sometimes perfumes, incense, flowers, that sort of thing. And touches. This is a very, very big one, isn't it? Because of course it's the comfort of the body, and it's exercising the body, sexual relationships, and so on. So this is one aspect of upadana, is of course our sense pleasures. And it's a very important place for human beings, because it's part of our usual experience. And this is why the Buddha is often encouraging us to renounce, isn't it? because those sense pleasures, where do they take us? They take us out into the world. When we renounce, we're looking for the happiness within ourselves. And so that's really the beginning of the spiritual path. And in actual fact, when you really look at renunciation, we are actually giving up a lesser happiness for a greater happiness. I mean, this is so obvious in a deeper meditation, where the joy and bliss, the tranquility, the clarity, the power of the mind is so evident and so powerful for us, which is nothing, which you can hear from Ajahn Brahm and others too. The power of jhana makes everything else look pale in comparison. And of course, one of the strongest things we're really taking refuge in, and you see it in our lives, and often we take more refuge in this than we say in the Buddha, and that is our self-view. What I, me and mine, but really my view, my opinions, all these things. And we identify so much with our bodies, sometimes with our mind. We think we own things. And we identify with our nationality, our gender, our likes and dislikes. That's a big one, actually, for identification of who we are. Because identification is really just a way of bolstering, isn't it, our view of who we are. Because we're not, in reality, we're not sure who we are, really. And so we're trying to cling on to things that we can support our sense of who we are. And of course, very, very big part of the self-view is the worldly conditions, the worldly conditions, the 8 worldly conditions of gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and anonymity, pleasure and pain. And we really run after all these things, and they're so important. We run after gain, obviously. we shrink away from loss. Nobody wants to lose, whether it be property, whether it be a relationship, whatever it is. And we want praise, not blame. We want fame, not anonymity. And we want pleasure, not pain. So we attach to a lot of a view of being the doer, that we're doing stuff. We're, building up our power, our status, position, all this stuff, money. And you see, this is so important for people. So these worldly wins are an aspect that really, really engages with our view of who we are, how we define ourselves. So you think of yourself as a successful business person. I'm this. I've got these possessions. I have this house, this status, this position in society, etc. There's all these things we chase after, are the worldly views. So the worldly conditions. And of course, one of the big things that is an attachment for all of us is our views. And we are attached to, identify with so many views. And I'm sure all of you have probably been talking about the Ukraine, and you've probably heard X number of views from X number of people, all of whom are obviously experts. I've heard quite a bit of this, and I do reflect on that how we can grasp onto, can attach to these sorts of views of things, whether it be COVID-19, cricket, philosophy, psychology, our national identity, nationalism, all these things. And over the years, I've really become aware of how important our views are. They're really shaping our lives and actions. People, views, opinions, beliefs, people think, oh, there's not much, but they really are shaping our lives and our actions and our minds too. So, and people really can get wound up, can't they? They can get very passionate about some of these views. And it's very obvious with that they can lead to very unwholesome states of mind, very unwholesome states of action and speech. that result from that. So this is another aspect of who our attachments that we take as our refuge. And sometimes rites and rituals, yeah, for sure. People think these things are going to, bring enlightenment. This is another one that the Lord Buddha mentions. Rites and rituals, Silamata Paramasa. And of course we have them in our own lives too. Whether we think they'll lead to enlightenment is another thing. But we do certainly have our rites and rituals, our routines and schedules you could see in our everyday life that we're very attached to, and which give us a feeling of comfort, reassurance, security, and a context or a tradition. And of course we can, and you can see it in Buddhism, there can be taking of refuges and precepts as rituals. But they will not, I don't think many people would think this is going to lead to enlightenment. I would hope not. So one would ask, from that Gata that I mentioned before at the beginning from the Dhammapada, are these secure refuges that lead to the end of suffering? And of course, they are, aren't they? They're external refuges, most of these, not internal refuges. And because they rely on so much on the outside world, on others, even the way we define ourselves. And we can't really own these attachments. We can't take them with us even. So, and they're obviously very impermanent. And that's one of the things that's really useful to reflect on, especially with our views, how our views change over time. Things that we thought so important. And later on, we may think, well, how foolish. Did I really believe that? And of course, we possibly did at that time. You can see that over, when we were children, the things we believed in, and maybe the things we believe in now totally different when we wouldn't subscribe at all to those things that we believed in childhood. So, and as I mentioned, we can't take these things with us. Our attachments don't lead to going beyond suffering and satisfaction. They just lead to more of samsara. They don't lead to the end of suffering. They don't lead to awakening, to the highest happiness. So we can reflect what is worthwhile taking refuge in. Of course, we say the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And I'll come to that. That's the usual, so I'll come to that in a moment, just a little bit anyway. But one of the things that we are taking refuge in, many people are taking refuge in, is our bodies. And you see that in the West particularly, that people are trying to make them, it happens in Sri Lanka too, it's a strong thing to make them strong, look beautiful, look handsome. And here, and I'm sure it's the same in Sri Lanka, many people spending a lot of time in gyms, beauty parlors, and that sort of thing. But of course, the body is always going to let us down. It's not ours. It's only rented accommodation, isn't it? And when old age or any time really comes, or when sickness comes, we can die. And it reminds me of the story of Vakali, Venerable Vakali, from the suttas. And Venerable Vakali was attached to the Lord Buddha's physical appearance. You probably remember that story. And he followed him around constantly and wanted to be in the Lord Buddha's presence all the time. And of course, the Lord Buddha said to him, it's not fitting to attach to this. He actually used more strong words, foul body. And we can't think of the Buddha's body as foul, but I think it's extraordinarily attractive and charismatic, but nevertheless. And then he said, but one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. And one who sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma. Because when we think of it, the Buddha is his nature, what he's developed, what he's realized is the Dhamma. He's become a Dhamma. And he's pointing Vakali away from the body to the mind and to the refuge in wisdom, to understanding the Four Noble Truths. So it obviously points us towards our minds being a refuge. When we develop our minds, we can take a refuge in that developed mind, take shelter from an uncertain world. And it can be our internal refuge. And it reminds me of another Dhammapada verse. You know this too. It's number 160. I should have given the numbers of the other ones too. And the translation is, I'll read it. Yeah, I won't give it the Pali. Oneself indeed is one's own protector. What other protector could there be? With self-control, one gains a protector hard to obtain. So of course, we realize, as the Buddha often said, he was only the shower of the way. He's pointing out the path for us, and he can't walk it for us. That is up to us. And we are the protectors, or we are the harmers of ourselves in many ways. I often think it's something that's come to me in recent times, that these defilements that give us such a hard time are really like self-harming. And the way, if we strengthen them, we really are self-harming ourselves. And with self-control, this ability to say no to our negative states of mind, whether that be from lobha, greed, or of desire, you could call it, aversion, dvesha, or delusion, moha. When we can say no, when we can restrain the mind, then we are protecting ourselves, protecting our minds. And this is actually, and not tormenting ourselves, not tormenting our minds. So this is a very important thing, that we realize that we are our own protector. We have to be. Buddha can't do it for us. If he could, he would have. But one of the things that's very obvious that we can take refuge in, we're talking about things that can take refuge in, are our good qualities. And these are things coming from the Dhamma, from the Buddha's teaching, our generosity, our virtue, and not to minimize the incredible importance of virtue. A person that doesn't kill or harm others or themselves, doesn't steal, doesn't engage in sexual misconduct, and doesn't lie, and doesn't take alcohol and drugs. That person is really someone special. It's not a common thing in this world. So that's virtue is one of those things we can take refuge in. And our kindness is a great refuge, because when we are kind, many of the negative aspects of the mind, many of the defilements don't get so much opportunity. We realize, no, this is not kind. That's what I often reflect these days. Is this kind? Kind to myself, kind to others? And of course, other qualities that we can take refuge in, the good qualities, are our compassion and caring. And that's very important. Our harmlessness and gentleness. And this is, of course, we're talking in this area about samana sankappa, our right motivations. This is part of the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. And also when we're developing more selflessness in our lives, when we're there to serve, to help others, this is a wonderful quality to have, especially if we are doing it with the right intention, not with a sense of, because you often hear this self-sacrificing, don't we? And it sounds great, but I think sometimes it sounds like it's a negative for the person who's doing it. Whereas when we are selfless, we actually should give rise to more happiness and joy, that we can help others, we can help ourselves. And of course, the other quality that's of course paramount in Buddhism is, of course, understanding, wisdom, prajna, panya, coming from our experience, and also from, when we say coming from experience, that's of course direct understanding. And I always liked Ayakima's definition of insight. She said she called that understood experience. Our experience, not the Buddha's experience. And of course, the Buddha is pointing us to where that experience will be very useful to understand. And but it's for us to realize. And so we can take refuge in our good qualities more and more through the path of practice, the Noble Eightfold Path. And I won't go very much into the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, but I'll read the gathas that come after verses, the Dhammapada verses that come after the ones that I read earlier. And this is verse 190, so the previous ones were 188 and 189, verses 188 and 189. This is verse 190. But when someone going for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha sees with right insight the Four Noble Truths, suffering, the arising of suffering, the overcoming of suffering, and the Eightfold Path leading to the ending of suffering, then this is the secure refuge. This is the supreme refuge. By going to such a refuge, one is released from suffering. So that's quite a wonderful gathas, isn't it? And it reminds me of another sutra of the Lord Buddha's, in which he's talking about making ourselves as islands. And this one is from the Connected Discourses on the Khandas, the aggregates. It's the Samyutta Nikaya 2243, and it's called With Yourselves as an Island. And it ties in beautifully with that point I just made. And it says, at Savatthi, bhikkhus, dwell with yourselves as an island, with yourselves as a refuge, with no other refuge, with the Dhamma as an island, with the Dhamma as a refuge, with no other refuge. When you dwell with yourselves as an island, the basis itself should be investigated thus. From what are sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair born? How are they produced? So this is reflecting on the four noble truths, isn't it? The first noble truth is suffering. From what are sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair born? How are they produced? And this is where we can use this as part of our refuge, as it were, basis for our refuge, understanding the nature of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness or suffering, looking into it in our own experience. And in that way, becoming islands, becoming an island for ourselves, a refuge for ourselves, with no other refuge. And it's Dhamma as our island and Dhamma as our refuge. Because when we are looking at our lives in terms of these universal qualities, dukkha is not we can experience it personally. Of course, there are our personal experience of our husband, our wife, our children, our grandparents dying, passing away. And this is obviously going to be personal dukkha. But we can also see, that this is part of the Arya Satya. And we can understand this is something that all beings experience. And this is a wonderful thing. Living in a Buddhist monastery, every day we do the dedications of merit. And we read out lists of people for the day and some ongoing ones. And it reminds me all the time of these the universality of dukkha, of all the teachings of the Buddha, basically, that they're there in our lives all the time. And even though the names change, the theme, the universal quality of dukkha, suffering, where it's coming from is what the Buddha is focusing on here. And of course, that is coming from, of course, how are they born, these negative qualities of the mind in particular, but body too. And it comes from craving, from wanting. We know that. We know that in theory, but to know it in our lives, that makes the difference. To know it for ourselves, that becomes direct experience. And then we will know, we can possibly then understand the way out of dukkha, the third noble truth, which is the letting go of that very same craving, the letting go of that wanting. And we also know the path that takes us to that, and that is the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is, that takes us, right. So these things are, that's where this Dhamma can lead us. So those verses are very nice. And of course, we're pointing to the refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, which I haven't got time to go into. But I would like to, perhaps on another occasion, we can talk about them. But they're very important, they're very inspiring qualities that can give our lives direction, meaning, and purpose. And the Buddha is, of course, the inspiration, the rediscoverer of the path. And the path that he discovered is the Dhamma. And that's the path that we practice, the Noble Eightfold Path. And so, and the Sangha is showing us the way to, and of course, when we say Sangha, of course, it's the Arya Sangha, the Noble Sangha, whether they be monks, nuns, laymen, or lay women. Those that have really practiced the path to the stage of awakening, either fully or partially. So this is the inspiration for us too, that really we see the example of the Buddha, and he's such a good example. His life, his qualities, they're a real example for us. The Dhamma, the roadmap, the map of the territory we need to cover, and then the Sangha, the lived examples that can inspire us in our lives, just by sometimes some people, their presence is enough, isn't it? It can really have a big impact on one when we have the Sangha as a part of our refuge. And it's so important to have these lived examples. We have the texts, and we have the sutras, of course, and all this, and that's wonderful. But when we see and lived an example of a quality that's well lived, well expressed by somebody, that really makes an impact on us. Whether it be kindness, compassion, joy for others, equanimity, these are obviously the 4 Brahma Viharas, or whether it's wisdom, the generosity, contentment. There's many aspects that we can see. So that can encourage us that we can do it. And I always think, when we think of the Sangha, and we can think, if we think, often people think, well, I don't know if I could do this. But then, as often pointed out, what about Angulimala? What about him? He was a serial killer. And according to the text, had killed 999 people. And yet he had the qualities that were enough to give rise to awakening, full awakening. And also think of Patachara, thinking of that from the nun side. She was quite crazy when she first met Buddha, and naked, half naked, when she met the Buddha. And she became an arahant too, So I think this is a real encouragement. The story is, if we only had people who had no problems and realized the Dhamma, that would not be as encouraging as when we hear of people that, in a sense, were really coming from very, very difficult background, and they realize the Dhamma. So it can encourage us in a big, big way. And I know for people that are in prison, for instance, when they hear about Venerable Angulimala, it gives them a lot. I was in a psychiatric hospital a few years ago, and the people there, they really could identify with Angulimala. It gave them a lot of inspiration and also, hope that they too could rise above the difficulties they were experiencing in their lives, obviously mental difficulties, but it's true for all of us. So these 3 refuges, and just this general reflection on the importance of refuge can be very useful for us in our lives. So, and of course, I will this afternoon at 1:30, I'll do a recollection, but not of the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. It will be based on the Sangha. It will be about it will actually be on Kalyana Mittas, which to me is like a subset of the Sangha, because that recollection, and I'll talk about that this afternoon a little bit before we actually do the guided meditation. So that will be how we, this afternoon, what we focus on in the guided meditation. So let us develop an inner refuge and tap into the power and the energy that comes from refuge. It is the power of inspiration. It's something you see, you hear, and you can see with Ajahn Brahm is so important. And it will deepen our faith, the emotion of faith. Sometimes we call it, because people in English, they don't like faith because it sounds too Christian to them. They prefer confidence or conviction, or sometimes they use commitment even. And it will deepen our aspirations or our intentions to practice the Noble Eightfold Path, which is a second factor. And it'll give more rise to more and more sincerity and commitment in order to develop the ultimate refuge, which is Nibbana. That's where the whole of the Buddha's teaching is taking us for those that are ready to go for the whole path, for the destination. So I'd like to finish there, and if there is enough time, I think now is almost 11 o'clock, I think after 11 o'clock in Sri Lanka. Is there any time for comments or questions, complaints? Maybe some of you, your tummies are, are grumbling and ready for the lunch Dhamma. But if there is time, I can answer, say, one question, or we can have it later. So up to you.